has apologised for the series of videos he posted over the weekend in which he dismissed his accusers as middle-class women of a certain age. There are 13 former contestants who've come forward claiming he engaged in behaviour of a sexually harassing nature. He denies the claims. Downing Street said his defence in these videos completely inappropriate and misogynistic. There do remain questions tonight for BBC management about the culture of the programme and their response to the repeated complaints that were made by contestants. Joining us to discuss is Dorothy Byrne, who was editor-at-large at Channel 4 and head of news and current affairs for almost 2 decades. Dorothy, good to have you with us. Do you think MasterChef should have aired tonight?
No, on balance, I don't think it should have aired. Although I know that would have been very sad for the specific contestants. I think it made it appear to the public as if the BBC thinks it's acceptable and fine. In the context that we now know that the BBC has known about complaints about Gregg Wallace for more than 10 years, and although we are informed in 2017 a top executive told him his behaviour was unacceptable, he was allowed just to carry on. And now I think it does look to the public as if things, it's very much business as usual and not really a serious problem. So it gives off the wrong message.
So do you think it seems that the BBC has put the onus on the independent production company when in fact the complaints were raised with the BBC and had been raised since 2008?
Absolutely. The onus is on the BBC. The BBC is the broadcaster. What does the public care about an independent production company that it has never heard of? We know that for more than a decade, the BBC knew there were complaints about this man. The BBC has told us that it has robust processes. Clearly, it doesn't have robust processes at all. And it has said that conduct of the type described is unacceptable. But it accepted it for years. It knew about him and it still allowed him to carry on being one of its stars.
So you think they made a bad decision to air the programme tonight? Did they make bad decisions going all the way back? Because I've got the email here that Asma Mir, our former colleague, sent to Kate Phillips, senior manager at the BBC. She's in charge of unscripted programmes. And this is what she said. She said, should anything happen in the future, I don't want to feel guilty when people say, why wasn't anything said before? Or for producers or editors to claim they didn't know. So the question is, if these allegations are upheld, should there be consequences for the BBC managers that were in charge?
Of course there should. Nothing could be clearer in what Asma Mir is saying. She is warning of the serious consequences for the reputation of the BBC and for the people who work there. And yet we know that he was allowed to carry on working. I mean, almost every hour more complaints are revealed. And this is what the BBC keeps getting wrong. We hear again and again when complaints arise about a man that it turned out that people in the BBC knew about it for years and that management knew about it for years. I really think that the BBC needs to call in outsiders to help it. There is something wrong with its culture. This isn't a matter of processes. This is a matter of a culture of tolerating bad behaviour when it's an important man.
Fraser, our producer's been working diligently today, calling previous contestants, and she came back tonight and she said that of the people that she'd spoken to, many of them didn't want to come on air, but she said it was a 50-50 split. But interestingly, she said among the men, they didn't see a problem with the behaviour. It was the women contestants who had a problem.
Well, I'd be interested to know of how many of the women contestants that you spoke to actually did say there was a problem. I mean, one of his defences is that he's worked with hundreds, thousands of contestants over the years, and that only a small number of, as he puts it, middle-class women of a certain age have complained. Now, if research is being done to other contestants and they find out, no, this was a theme amongst, I mean, forget the men, right? It was a theme of women who felt he was behaving this way, then this does point to a large cultural issue that Dorothy was mentioning there. We know Asmamir's email is very damning. She obviously wasn't just saying, hang on, this is a bit funny. She was saying, I can see this blowing up in future, and people looking back thinking, well, why did nobody say anything?
She was told it would be dealt with, but she wasn't informed that it had been logged.
Well, it's strange. I mean, what does dealt with mean in this situation? Does it mean having a word with him, slapping his wrist, telling him, look, dial it down a little bit? I mean, remember, this would have been also, I think, pre-Hugh Edwards as well. I think when the Hugh Edwards scandal, which is, in my view, far more serious there, that he was a staffer in the BBC, absolutely one of its main secular saints, and he basically, the culture there was that somebody who had been put on such a big pedestal by the corporation wasn't really investigated in the way that it could have been, that the BBC's own complaints department didn't follow it through, leaving the complainants to go to the Sun newspaper, which revealed it. Now, I like to think that after the Hugh Edwards blow-up, the way the BBC deals with this has changed fundamentally. But I think
it has internally, but it seems externally it hasn't.
Well, I think the problem here is that what Gregg Wallace said yesterday is indicative of his attitudes towards women more generally. Now, whether or not that proves that the allegations that have been made are where they are, that's for the process to sort out. But it's clear that the process hasn't been working, because now we hear that there are more women
But he dealt very
forward.
quickly with Jermaine Janus.
Well, I think when you're saying that your producer ran around today and didn't get any men to say that they'd seen a problem, I mean, I take it that means either they saw this behaviour and thought it wasn't a problem, or they never saw it. Both of those things are likely to be true. These sorts of attitudes are prevalent across the creative industries, across many professions. But I'm sorry to say that I'm fed up of having the same conversation that I've been having now with people for decades. I was involved in violence against women work from the 1980s and the 1990s. I worked with violent men in the 2000s, and we had the same conversations in 1983 and 1984. And colleagues of mine who'd been working in that
Which
work
were
for
what?
20
That
years
the women
ago,
saw
that the attitudes that were prevalent were often having to be left to women to challenge, but men who saw them either didn't see a problem or didn't think it was for them to speak up. And that really matters. It really does, because when you leave it up to women, it allows someone like, say, Gregg Wallace, and I'm not saying whether or not the allegations have been proven, but it means that he's able to say, well, only this group of people had a problem. We don't yet know whether there's other people who did, but I do know...
Do you think they should pull the programme?
I would really like them to have pulled the programme, because I do agree with Dorothy, it sends a bad message, but I'd also really like for men who may have witnessed any bad behaviour amongst their colleagues in any walk of life to start seeing it as their problem too.
There is an issue, in fact, the Broadcasting Union, BEC2, highlighted this today, particularly with the number of freelancers that work in the industry, is that if you don't uphold complaints, or at least investigate them fully, then there's a lack of trust in the process. People then come forward less and less.
And that's probably why, if it's true that it's only middle-class women who've made those allegations from the MasterChef,
women in power.
the celebrity, women
who have
in
a profile.
power. Now that's really typical. I spent a lot of last week talking to freelancers, colleagues of mine and friends of mine who work in the creative industries, about, in fact, other scandals. And we agreed that part of the problem there is that the women who are most likely to be targeted very often are those with the least power and the most to lose.
But would you agree that there should be due process? Because we do this. There's trial by media. He's been suspended. He's could well lose his job.
He chose to make a video saying that it was all about middle-class women making
But I do agree about due process. Remember when the Hugh Edwards scandal happened, I mean, certain BBC people, ex-ones like John Sopel, were absolutely
But then the
convinced
BBC was criticised for not sacking him immediately. Where do you draw the line?
Well, I think due process ought to be... I don't think you can basically sack anybody on an allegation. There was no criminality. It was slightly different with Hugh Edwards. It ended up being criminal behaviour that he'd done. But here, there is... this is the question. What do you do when the allegations get serious? When does the threshold come for you to think, OK, we're going to suspend the person, or we're going to suspend the programme?
Or the manager.
Or the manager, yeah. But none of this seems to have happened at the moment.
I mean, there is such a thing as gardening leave. And, you know, if you're
But he
in
has
certain...
stepped back, hasn't he, from the programme, so he's saying.
But he didn't stop talking yesterday, and I think that's the bit
Well, he
that is
said he didn't
really
have the
getting to me.
headspace, and he's taking a step
I'm
back.
sorry. I mean, that just seems really weak to me. I'm afraid to say I just think that displays more of his attitudes than any of us really would have liked. And in other professions, someone would have been put on leave with full pay. And pending an investigation, you're absolutely right about due process, Fraser, I completely agree. But sometimes the balance is being struck here is the reputation of the BBC, and that really matters, and the protection of other people.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's have a quick look at the stories on the